Okay. Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
Alaikum salam, rahmatullah.
You have joined the webinar today, The People's Effort to Return to Allah, an oral history of the Dar-ul-Islam Movement in the United States. So I'm here with Dr. Samiha Rahman and someone who's also dear to my heart, El-Hajj Ali Muhammad, also known as my Abu. And so we're going to give it a few minutes, just a couple of minutes for folks to join, and then we will begin. So I know how folks like to kind of trickle in, but I do want to respect everybody's time. So about 5 after, inshallah, we'll begin.
Okay.
Okay. And just to make sure everybody is in the right place. Okay.
SubhanAllah, this is a unique picture here.
And I'm sure you're going to tell me a story about it, right?
Well, you know, see that
Yeah.
see that handsome guy with that white turban on, Rahimullah? He became he was appointed as the first Qadi in the movement. That's Ali Abdul-Aziz, Rahimullah, from Philadelphia originally. And he took on a monumental task because he had the responsibility to start trying to answer a lot of the domestic issues that was coming up, that people couldn't, people just coming out of dunya. There were all sorts of questions that came up, how to proceed, how not to proceed, what to do in this case, what to do in that case. And alhamdulillah, Ali took to it like a fish to water, and so, yeah, this is an interesting crowd here. This is one of the first Mujahideen gang here. Alhamdulillah.
So how about we, folks are still coming in, but inshallah, we can go ahead and get started. This webinar is going to be recorded and posted. I would love for people to continue the conversation after this one. And inshallah, what it can lead to, which is sort of my hope and prayer, is that we do more, right, with more urgency, gather the history, just with you know, showing that picture and saying that brother right there with the white turban, this is his name, this is what he did. That's, for me, that's like treasure, right? That we cannot take for granted. As time goes by, there will be less and less people who can tell us who's in the photo. And so inshallah, there will be more conversations with, you know, what I call sort of like daughters and sons of the Dar, speaking to their parents, their grandparents, who can be able to bring this history to life. It is still very much present. And so we don't want to take for granted that, one, that our folks will live forever. We want them to, but that there's a responsibility that I think as the younger generation, we certainly have, and that is to listen to those stories, to express appreciation and gratitude for, again, what you said was a monumental task, right, of the time, and to remember that this was essentially a young people's movement, that there were some who were taking their Shahada at 13, 14 years old, who were embracing the movement and its mission and its vision, and that cannot be taken for granted. So before we continue, Abu, if you can just open us up with dua.
Naam, inshallah. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Inna alhamdulillah nahmaduhu wa nasta'inuhu wa nastaghfiruhu ghafurur rahim. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lahu wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Amma ba'd. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Hu huwa Allahu ahad, Allahu samad, lam yulid wa lam yulad wa lam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad. And I think we all know Surah Ikhlas. It is a surah that Rasulullah alayhi wassalatu wasalam said was equivalent to 1/3 of the Quran. And so by utilizing this, it covers all of the important areas for us to reflect on, and particularly with regards to Aqidah. And that's the foremost objective and point right now in my mind, and that is to try to bring that point home with regards to the Aqidah, inshallah, which was the basis of Dar-ul-Islam. Dar-ul-Islam was about trying to establish Aqidah more than anything else. One of the things the Imam Rahimahullah used to always talk about, because some of us as youngsters was always bucking, talking about, we ain't moving fast enough, we're not doing this, we're not doing that. And he had no problem reminding us that Rasulullah labored in Mecca 13 years, just trying to get people to purify their hearts, so that when they were charged with different responsibilities, they were able to carry it out wholeheartedly and sincerely. And I think that was one of the things that was kind of missed. Some people didn't do that. As some of you know, early on in the movement, when the Imam became officially Imam in 68, there was a split. And that split was prompted because Imam Yahya Rahimullah made a decree. And that decree was that smoking keef or marijuana was haram. And people fell out. It was all over the place, you know. And it was like, oh no, who you think he is? Talking about this, that, and the third is from the earth. And a lot of people, unfortunately, I don't think people were readers then. They weren't serious students of Deen. And so as I came to learn later on, that one of the things the Imam was referring to was a fatwa by Imam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, with regards to not just the issue of marijuana, but even with regards to smoking cigarettes, which was a serious abhorrent as far as I was concerned. I didn't need, when I became Muslim, like I said, I was 19, 20 years old. And I didn't need an elaborate explanation about the things that I shouldn't do. And smoking was one of them. It was because morally, I didn't feel that that was something that as a Muslim, I should do. So it was like, okay, I'm gonna give these cigarettes up, like I'm gonna give up all the rest of this stuff hanging out in these corners. I'm gonna leave all that alone. And it was based purely on submission, trust, and faith. I didn't have a whole lot more to go on it. One of the things, and I was honored that when I joined the movement at taking my Shahada, one of the first books I was ever given was a book called Milestones by Sayyid Qutb. And that book, that book sent me over mountains that was just like, man, where these guys come from with these ideas that they had. And it stuck to me, you know, like cement. And it became a part of my individual profile. That was something that I said, okay, this is what I have to do. Because one of the things that Sayyid Qutb talked about was being able to separate yourself from Jahiliyyah, and realizing that Jahiliyyah was not, linguistically, was not a term that was attached exclusively to some past period, but rather it was a description of the condition of the society of man. And a lot of people never understood it that way. You know, when they say Jahiliyyah, to most people, they would think, well, you're talking about during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. It's like, no, you know, that's inclusive, but it's broader than that. And I think like I said, one of the things that helped me understand that was that book, Milestones. And I encourage all Muslims, in particular youth, young Muslims, to read that book, because it was phenomenal. And it was a book that caused Sayyid Qutb to lose his life to.
Mhm.
because the Egyptian government, they weren't having it. You know, their whole thing was like, no, this man talking about, you know, this dunya is not for what we supposed to be, and it went on and on and on. So it was very monumental. So that's what one of the things that caused the very first split under the leadership of Imam Yahya was that he gave the edict that smoking marijuana was not lawful, and people went south after that. That was the very first split in the movement under his leadership.
Abu,
Yes.
I'm going to stop you right there so people know who you are. I think this is, alhamdulillah, this is a perfect example of, I think, where I get my passion for documenting the history of the Dar-ul-Islam movement. That was everyone's intro into why this is important. And so I want to properly introduce both of you as the guests for this webinar, and to discuss what I think is a very significant, and I think I can say that objectively, a very significant movement that has influenced the development and richness of Islam in the United States, and I think has even broader implications. But the pieces of the puzzle of the history, I think, have not been sort of well cataloged, so we can understand all of the first person accounts, what brought people to the movement, what kept them there, and what we still can learn from what the movement was attempting to do. And so with that, I want to, again, properly introduce this young man here, El-Hajj Ali Muhammad, who's a lifetime member of the Dar-ul-Islam Movement since 1970 until its demise, and is currently a counselor at the East House Corporation and Imam at Rochester Psychiatric Center in New York. He is father of 13, grandfather of 14, and great-grandfather of 20. And this is also my Abu. So I'm one of the 13. And it really is an honor for me to be able to bring you into this history project, because I feel like it's one that has been certainly in the making for years. I've been after you I said one day I'm just gonna have to record every single conversation that I have with you, because I'm always like writing notes and asking questions. And for many, many years, you've always indulged my curiosity about the movement, and certainly the hard questions that I wanted to really understand about what that life was for you. So I'm happy to have you here, and I'm also, like I said, a little bit nervous because everything that I've gathered, I'm always checking. It's like, what is my Abu going to think? Like, is this the right direction? Am I representing this history well? And so it has been truly an effort in being able to understand myself a lot better, right, as I also listen to what you have to share.
Alhamdulillah. Let me just make a side note.
Okay, no, go ahead.
One of the side notes was, it's an honor for me to have that come from you, because in my studying of the various imams, and I'm talking about Imam Malik here as an example, and some of the imams' greatest students and promoters of the ideas of their fathers was these imams' daughters. Not always their sons, but with their daughters. It was, if it wasn't a daughter, it was a wife, and that's something that we don't often try to display, carry out, and expound on. And so I'm honored with that. And alhamdulillah, you are doing an excellent job. I couldn't ask for anything more.
Oh, mashallah. You're gonna make me blush. Alhamdulillah. And also joining us is Dr. Samiha Rahman, who is Assistant Professor of Human Development at California State University in Long Beach. She holds a PhD in Africana Studies and Education from the University of Pennsylvania, and her scholarship examines how young people and their families engage race, religion, and education to achieve justice and liberation. She's working on her first book, which I am eagerly awaiting, Black Muslim Freedom Dreams, Islamic Education, Diasporic Exchange, and Collective Care. So telling the stories of multi-generational community of Black Muslims in the Tijani Sufi Tariqa who live, learn, and strive for liberation between the US and Senegal. And one of the aspects of this history project that was very important to me is to understand the perspective of women, how women approach this movement, and in particular, their emphasis on caring for each other, for children, around education, entrepreneurship, all of the ways that women build communities that are often either taken for granted or are underreported in the histories. So Dr. Samiha, I'm really happy to have you here as well to add your perspective. I want to do some acknowledgements of this work from a Crossroads project through Princeton University. I was awarded the first grant as a Community Stories Fellow to begin to pull together this work, and it has been tremendously helpful. And I want to say that this is the beginning. I think this is a living project and one that I'm certainly grateful for the folks who have come before me, who have written, who have spoken about their time in the Dar, who have collected information. So I'm certainly not the first one. And so I'm hoping that this can be a catalyst to sort of renew our interest in seriously documenting this history because it's important. So I want to acknowledge also Interfaith America, who invested in this work through the Black Interfaith Fellowship, and then Muslim Wellness Foundation's Omar Ibn Said Institute for Black Muslim Studies. I'm the founding executive director of Muslim Wellness Foundation, and it has always been important for us to, again, lift up and acknowledge the wisdom of Black Muslims in that all of the ideas and experiences that we have related to how we begin to think about freedom and sovereignty and community and home contributes to an improved sense of well-being. And so if someone is thinking, well, how is Muslim Wellness Foundation related to this work? It is because we believe that wellness is much more than the absence of sort of anxiety or depression. It is about a quality of life that allows us to connect as sincerely and authentically to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to ourselves. And so when we want to understand what will work well for us in the future, it is important that we look to the past. I also want to acknowledge the scholars, again, who have taught and have written about Islam in America, about African American history. Those scholars, Dr. Amina Al-Din, Mama Amina is someone who I have also looked for approval, just in terms of am I again, with respect and humility, being able to write in a holistic way about our lives. Dr. Iksan Bagby, who has done this research for many, many decades as well. Akil Fad, who has done also Dar research. And so those are the folks who have contributed to my thinking and gathering of information. And I want to lift up the name of my late mentor, Dr. Deborah Majid, and how she insisted through her own work around Muslim womanist philosophy that African American women in particular are gatherers and producers of knowledge. And so for me, this is a way to also honor her scholarly work, is to think about, again, we must continue to gather that knowledge to the best of our ability. And certainly the Dar-ul-Islam collection, Kameelah, another Kameelah with her father, Brother Khalil Abdul-Kabir, the Dar-ul-Islam collection. If you have not seen it, it is beautiful. The photos that I have on the website, thepeopleseffort.com, are drawn from this collection. And I think it's one of the brilliant and also unique aspects of this work is that there are photos that document, right, the movement as it's growing. And we don't always have that. And certainly the personal accounts that have been written by Dr. Kamal Hassan Ali and Sheikh Mahmoud Ibrahim. These are all, again, testimonies to just the meaning and significance of the Dar that have to be acknowledged. And finally, those who agreed to sit with me and answer my questions about their families and their experience with the Dar. So former Dar members, children of the Dar, who shared and really wanted to contribute to what I hope becomes a living archive. And of course, special shout out to my Abu, again, who always indulged my questions about this history in such a patient and loving way. So I wanted to answer this question of why now, right? Sometimes it seems obvious to us why this history is necessary and important to document, but it's actually not obvious. And so I think it needs to be explicitly stated. This is one reason. Imam Asim Abdul-Rashid passed away. May Allah accept, all of his good work and raise him to the highest levels of Jannah. He passed away the same year, 2022, that I became a Crossroads Fellow for this project. And again, it was that feeling of urgency, right? What happens when we lose our elders, we lose their knowledge? It's just irreplaceable. And we cannot take sort of the significance of their work and their efforts for granted. And so this is why now. Just a few weeks ago, we lost another scholar and leader, Dr. Mukhtar Curtis, who 30 years ago wrote a chapter about the Dar. So exactly 30 years ago, again, here are community members who are trying to capture some of that history. And this work pulls it together under the resources. This is another reason. There is a non-Black Muslim artist who drew this painting and captioned it with spirituality on the South Side. So her description of this painting was, it depicts Muslim worshipers entering a storefront mosque in the South Side of Chicago in the 90s, reflecting a sense of the racially diverse and spirited religious atmosphere at the time. Hashtag historical art, hashtag Chicago, hashtag South Side. When I saw this, I said, absolutely not. That is not a picture from the 90s in the South Side of Chicago. And I have to be honest, I was offended. I wanted to, at first I was angry, like how could this be mistaken for anything else? But because it's obviously, right, the inspiration for this photo, for this painting, comes from this photo, which is Masjid Mujahideen in Philadelphia around 1973. And soon as I saw the painting, I was like, that's not correct. And so you see here what was changed. It says Chicago 97, Bonds of Brotherhood. But what was altered was this sign, Dar-ul-Islam, Masjid al-Mujahideen. And I took such offense. I just felt myself becoming angry that there would be, for me, this level of sort of like casual erasure of the movement. I tried to contact the artist, where this was posted, and didn't get a response. And what I reflected on was, it is actually my responsibility to make sure that my community is not erased. It is not anyone else's. And so offering that correction, again, is the answer to the question of why now? That if we don't tell our stories, then people will erase us. They'll alter it. They'll tell different stories about it that are not accurate. And so whose responsibility is that? It's ours. And so this is in response to not just this incident, but others in which the history is fragmented, it is incomplete, and people sort of pick and choose and fail to understand the breadth and the depth of the movement. And so inshallah, my prayer is that this effort contributes to some of that corrective work, but it also inspires people to be more curious about this particular movement, but also the striving for Black Muslims over history, over decades, over centuries, to establish for themselves space to live and to learn and to connect with God. So what? Is always another question that we ask ourselves, right? In any research. Okay, that sounds great, but why? And I'm reminded of this African proverb, Sankofa, right? Usually people say like, go back and get it, go back and fetch it. But what it really means is to think about how we reclaim what has been lost, what has been forgotten. And again, this is our responsibility, and I would say obligation, to do this with urgency. And finally, from Freedom Dreams, the Black Radical Imagination, I pulled this quote and have used it as sort of a guiding reminder for myself. Too often, our standards for evaluating social movements pivot around whether or not they, quote, succeeded in realizing their visions, rather than on the merits or power of the visions themselves. By such a measure, virtually every radical movement failed. And yet it's precisely these alternative visions and dreams that inspire new generations to struggle for change. And so I am very much committed to ensuring that we can understand to the best of our ability those visions and dreams that inspired, right, generations of Black Muslims and other people, right, not just limited to Black Muslims, but certainly what was the merits, what was the power, what was the influence that we should appreciate. Okay. So some of the really iconic photos from the Dar-ul-Islam collection are of the festivals in Brooklyn. And here is Shirley Chisholm, who was a presidential candidate, right? Who is hanging out, right, at the bazaar. Abu, it sounds like you want to tell a story about this picture?
Well, it was one of the bazaars that we used to have annually on Herkimer Place. And Sister Shirley Chisholm always thought about her local constituents. We weren't that political in sense of dealing with politics, but we did support people. We supported her. We were at some of her events to try to make sure she was always kind of safe and wasn't subject to just some nondiscreet person approaching her and doing anything. And she had no problem showing up, even when there was cameras there and folks was asking questions. What are you doing here? And I was like, listen, I'm here with my folks. And she was very clear about that, because she was the best I do or die. That was her. Best I do or die. So yes, this was
And what year was this? Do you remember?
I want to say 72, if I can remember correctly, around 1972, because I can, the only face I'm able to see right now is Brother Atiq Rahimullah. He's the third brother on the left. Okay. And then, you know, other folks, I can't see any faces. It's been such a long time ago, I don't remember who was where and all of the people that was there. But all of these brothers were a part of Dar-ul-Islam and had no problem being present at all events, at all costs, and at every time.
Alhamdulillah. So I sort of hinge so much of sort of my exploration around this idea of Dar-ul-Islam as the people's effort to return to Allah. And I think it's such a beautiful, clear, simple, powerful statement about, you know, this is what we're about.
Yeah.
And for that declaration to be made at the time that it was made, I think is also, again, something that we have to, I think, just sort of pause and to reflect on, you know, Black folks at the time who were saying, this is what we're about, right? And this is going to guide us in terms of evaluating what we're going to do, how we're going to represent ourselves. And again, this is a statement that is being made by young people, right? When I say young, this is between like average of like 14 to 35.
40 at tops.
40 tops.
At tops 40. But like I said, that, you know, I was only 20 at that time.
Wow.
In 1970.
Abu, I think we might have lost your connection.
You know, to see all of this happen, unique. It's really unique. And when that phrase was coined, it was coined not as a cliche, but this is what we are really about. You know, our effort in this concept of establishing a Dar-ul-Islam was to have it be the people's efforts to return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala both in this life and in the hereafter. That was the whole concept behind it.
Yeah. So this is, again, I think just being able to visually see, right, how folks wanted to be represented, right, how they told their own stories at the time. And this is taken from the magazine, the Dar magazine, Jihadul Akbar. But again, very simple declaration about there's no God but Allah, right? This is what our faith teaches us. And being able to see how people were gathering, right, to learn from one another, but also to build community. Again, I think we might take for granted when you can go to a city and say, okay, let me see where there's a masjid that I can make Jummah, right? But thinking at the time where it was in people's homes, right, that they were sort of meeting wherever they could, in that seeking, in wanting to figure out, right, what knowledge do I need? Who do I need to also be with in order to learn? So again, another page out of Jihadul Akbar. And again, emphasizing that this is what we're choosing, right, to do. I noticed in some of the photos how many of the men are wearing Palestinian keffiyehs, right? And this is, again, late 60s, early 70s, you know, and establishing that there is a connection that also transcends, you know, this country, right? We're looking to be a part of the Muslim Ummah, and also understand their struggles for freedom as well. So I wanted to, in this timeline and bringing together this history, talk about sort of the genealogy of the Dar. And, you know, I'm a trained clinical psychologist, but also a family systems therapist. So thinking about context, thinking about relationships, who were people learning from, where, you know, if we were to trace, right, our sort of spiritual lineage, right, in this country through the movement, what does that connect to? And what I think it helps us do is to understand some of those turning points. What was happening? What were people thinking? How were they speaking to each other about what they were learning, right? And doing it in ways that I think really emphasizes, right, that people are always in conversation with one another, right? This is not coming out of a vacuum. So, Dr. Samiha, do you want to share a little bit about who these individuals are?
I can, or I don't know, do you want to? Yeah, so this is on the left, Mother Khadija Faisal, and on the right, Sheikh Dawood Faisal. They were the founders of the Islamic Mission of America on 132 State Street in Brooklyn. And this is the community that the three brothers who started the Dar were going to. This was a masjid in downtown Brooklyn, started by Sheikh Dawood, who is from Grenada, and Mother Khadija, who's from Bermuda. So these are Afro-Caribbean Muslims who, again, in the 1930s, first in Harlem and then later in Brooklyn have created what we now call, a Sunni Orthodox mosque, where also because of where it was in Brooklyn, you're speaking of this internationalism, they would have, different like merchant seamen and other new immigrant Muslims even going to that masjid. But this was kind of the context that these brothers, this is what they were connecting to. They were, they embraced Islam and were attending this masjid. And then from my understanding, at some point, in part, I think having to do with the youthful perspective and the Black Power era and things like that, wanted to create their own space where they could, engage in an approach to Islam that really centered the needs and perspectives of working class Black folks. That would be my little jump in. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Absolutely. And when I was sort of gathering this information, it was important to first look at like primary sources, right? What were the people of the movement saying about themselves, right? Rather than sort of like commentary that comes later. And so what they're writing in 1974, right, in retrospect, is they knew that there was a natural affinity between Islam and the poor. They fully realized the ability of Islam to be an uplifting force for people, such as the poor and downtrodden of New York slums and ghettos. They sought to propagate the life-giving message of Islam in order to rouse the sleeping giant, which is this country's poor. And when I read these statements, I'm thinking, again, these are young people writing about what Islam can do, what they believe this life-giving message is.
Can I just say something? Oh,
sure.
I was gonna say, this quote is like so beautiful and so important and critical. Like this, like Islam is not just something that you do in the privacy of your home and you make sure you're praying 5 times a day and whatever else. Islam is literally this revolutionary foundation that can lead to total social transformation. And they understood that. And like, yeah, this is incredible. Like I literally just posted this in one of the WhatsApp groups a couple of days ago. Like, if we're thinking like, oh, what do we do now in America? Like, this is incredible. Like, so I just want to put an exclamation point on that. Like, this is so.
One of the things that was interesting about this part of the presentation was that area where the Islamic mission was at, with Sheikh Dawood Rahimullah, had developed in what was being called Arab Town, because a lot of Arabs had gathered there and it became sort of like their thing. And that's a part of what prompted those 3 visionary brothers to say, okay, listen, this is cool, alhamdulillah, but it's not reaching the masses of people. Our folks are not coming down to Arab Town looking for a set of dhikr beads or any of these other things. We need to take this message back into the heart of where folks need this religion, where they need this message of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and can thrive from there. And it was that motivated these visionary brothers, because the feeling was that those brothers at that time, the immigrants, were either unwilling or unable to understand and communicate with the people in whose midst they had settled. There was no serious dawah. If you was Muslim, you found out about where to go for Juma, because at that time that's the only place to go. Either you went there or you went to 72nd Street to the Islamic Center, but there was nothing on the grassroots level. And so seeing that became the motive factor for brothers saying, okay, listen, it's time to pull out and do something a little different here. And that became the premise for what was going on. And this is not to take away from anything that Sheikh Dawood did, because his work was phenomenal at that time. It was phenomenal. There's no doubt about it. It was a phenomenal piece of work, and it's going to go down in the history of Islam in this country, and it's going to stand out. But that was the beginning point.
Yes.
That wasn't the end point. That was the beginning point. And it gave birth to these brothers that you see on the screen now. Abdus-Shaheed, Abdul-Kareem, and Rijab Mahmoud. That's who that Mahmoud is. That's Rijab Mahmoud, who actually, when the three of them got together and decided what to do, they elected Rijab Mahmoud as the first imam of this new burgeoning fireball, so to say. It was like, okay, we got to do something. We got to have a leader. You're it. And it went from there, you know. And it went on. That was, I think, 63. And it progressed. And then alhamdulillah, subhanallah, you know, this picture just,
I know.
it wears me down, you know. This is my one and only imam. I ain't had no other imam after him. This was my imam, alhamdulillah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give him Jannah and make his grave spacious. And the work that he did, you know, to me can only be imagined almost like the work that existed during the time of the Sahaba, because the odds was against everything and everybody. And by the vision with this brother and the permission of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we were able to do in this country what has never been done before, and that was to establish the 5 salat and have the adhan called over a loudspeaker 5 times a day. That was it's unheard of now. It's
Absolutely.
unheard of now. You don't, you know, you go to a masjid, you might hear the adhan from inside the door, but over the loudspeaker, no. 5 times a day, masjids have become similar to businesses. They open at a certain time and they close at a certain time. During the life of Dar-ul-Islam, you could hit that buzzer and there was always somebody there to buzz you in, to let you in so that you can make salah no matter what time of the day or the night. That was the first, and it may very well be the last.
And I think it's important when, especially when we're talking about the genealogy and then what grows from that foundation. So it's not a competition. It's not, well, this is better than that. It's, well, there is growth, right? And Allah knows best, right? There is growth. And if there is a desire, right, within these 3 brothers to say, we have to bring this, right? They said life-giving message to the people, where it can rouse the sleeping giant, then that is their mission, right? And from all of my understanding, it doesn't become one that's antagonistic, right? It's just, you know, you think about, okay, how can I live and practice in the places, in the communities, so that I don't have to, right, go to this one place, but you know, Allah says, my earth is spacious. So what are we doing in order to expand and to think about how we can bring the message to the people? And again, that is something that, you know, Black people, right, in that search for essentially spiritual sovereignty, right? How do we make this faith, this connection to the divine also respond to our very real needs, right? So this quote was actually taken from Black Pilgrimage to Islam by Robert Dannon. And it talks about how, you know, it starts to almost look like, well, where are these sort of groups or clusters of people starting to find themselves, like new Americans, right? The Arab Muslim immigrants, the new Muslims, the African American converts, but also, you know, this response to, again, who can we tap in order to sort of teach this growing, right, community of people who are seeking answers, right, about the afterlife, but certainly, right, about the dunya, about this life as well. And so one of sort of the commentary that I have about this quote in particular is that, you know, it says Mahmoud led the Americans in that should say Fajr prayer, not fair prayer, every morning, and taught them Arabic directly from the Quran, led the prayer, right, patiently dispensing his wisdom, and within 3 years had convinced his students to emulate the Prophet's Hijra by establishing their own community in Brooklyn. And what I, and Abu, I'm curious about, kind of your thoughts on this, but I wanted to still center the three brothers, right? Rijab, Mahmoud, Yahya Abdul-Kareem, and thinking about, yes, and thinking about, yes, they were students, right, learning from this scholar who had come, and of course, certainly influenced by, but I want to center, right, the men who decided, right, that this was not going to be an easy journey, right, to sort of depart what was known and like a familiar location. And again, men who at this time was maybe in their mid to late 20s. So yes, I don't know if convinced his students sounds, I think puts too much significance on the role of Mahbub. I don't know, but I still want to ensure that we're giving sort of credit and respect to what they do with this knowledge, right? The actions that they take, and being able to what he says, emulate the Prophet's hijrah. I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Well, those three brothers were radical thinkers, and I think their vision was, why hasn't this message been brought to the grassroots? What was the issue? Why is it not there? Why are the people irresponsive to the local needs of the local brothers and sisters of the community? And so I think what agitated them was their desire to spread the message, as the Prophet ﷺ did in and around Mecca. When he got that message, he didn't go ballistic with it, but he certainly started advocating to people, inviting people to the religion. And that wasn't happening so much at that point. One of the things that you have to remember is that majority of these early Muslims were jazz musicians. And they came out, a lot of them came out of the Ahmadiyya movement. And, so they knew certain things that needed to be done, but, these other, most of the people didn't have the aspiration or the capability to do that. And it took a certain vibe to do it. I think part of the other thing was the influence of El-Hajj Malik Shabazz, rahimullah. I think because of what he was doing and the outreach that he had was very, very important. Because in fact, just as a side note, one of the sisters that was the secretary to El-Hajj Malik ended up marrying one of the wazirs in the Dar. And so a lot of things started coming together. And the one thing that they didn't want to do, they didn't want to go strictly nationalist, although there was a tendency to think our people, us and us and us, but they wanted to do it on the basis of Islam. So they were heavily influenced by El-Hajj Malik. And when he was assassinated, then it was like, okay, listen, we really got to get this thing together. And people started moving in those directions. And I think that was part of the catalyst for them to start moving out from the State Street Masjid and migrating back into the local communities, and to begin to advocate, preach, and teach the message of Islam, because as was with the Prophet ﷺ, and as often quoted, as you said here, that the poor and the downtrodden were serious receptacles for this message. And so they took that and they went that way. They didn't see what they thought needed to be done, that if Islam could affect them that way, then what could it do to the local brother or sister on the street corner if they heard this message? Right. What would they do and how would they do it? And so those radical vibes and inspirations is what led them to sit down and say, okay, this is good, but we got to do more. And the more became, we have to start, subhanAllah, the more became, we have to establish a movement of brothers that's going to move forward. And this was some of the ragtag.
So tell us about this picture.
Oh man, this was what was comprised of majority of the brothers of Rod at the time. These were the paramilitary brothers that had gotten together, that formulated the concept of Rod, and began to move forward, fi sabilillah, with no fear or reservation about their levels of commitments. We we used to train on the streets of Nostrand Avenue with rifles, and it petrified NYPD, and people like, why are these people marching up and down the street with rifles and carrying on? But it made people have a sense of, these brothers are for real. They're going to do something. They're going to protect us. And this crowd, some of them, a good portion of them now, are even deceased, as I'm looking at the picture here. And but these were the brothers, man. You know, subhanAllah.
So tell me, what did it mean also, right? I think prior to this time, and some, I think sort of the general American imagination, the iconic image of a Black Muslim, as they were called then, was NOI, right? And specifically the FOI, the fruit of Islam.
Right.
So what did it mean for people to see this representation, right, of Muslim men, right? And then, of course, I'll show pictures later of Muslim women. But what did it mean for people to see brothers like this with turbans, with kameez, like with long thobes, like what the people saying, right? Or assuming, surmising about this group of Muslims when they see them dressed this way, like in such a distinct way.
They knew that we weren't NOI. They were amazed that, well, I'm gonna say amazed. They were taken in because during that time, you must remember that there was a heavy influence of the African dashikis. And so seeing brothers in kameezes and thobes, you know, they had that Afrocentristic thing, and like, okay, these brothers are moving in another direction, away from wearing a bow tie, and so forth. And so I think people grasped that reality, and they worked with it, because they saw the dashiki. A lot of the people in the neighborhood that weren't Muslim started wearing dashikis. A lot of brothers would start wearing kufis, because it was like they were identifying, as people would say, I'm identifying with them brothers right there, because they different and they cool, and they're not afraid. I guess one of the best ways I could put it. And so yeah, that's what that was.
El-Hajj Ali, I think, sorry, no, I think what you're saying is so important. Even just thinking back to that Dannon quote of like, so were they influenced, or were they kind of a product and engaged with the world around them? And that's so important. Like, this is the 1960s, right? This is Black Power movement. You see, not only obviously dating back earlier with the Nation and the FOI, but this is the Black Panther Party. You think of these iconic images of Black people showing through their dress and whatever else, these visible images of Black power. And also like thinking about, yes, obviously the Dar was very much on the understanding of the Quran and the Sunnah, but also what was the legacy of Islam in America it had been a transformative force. So I think part of what you're saying of like them wanting to start their own movement is drawing in that understanding of Islam has always been this liberatory force that Dr. Kameelah, as you mentioned, is not only going to give people success in this life, but in the hereafter. And so how do we work, how do we reach the people like in the nation, you know, they're going fishing, but here they're like, how do we do it with this understanding of orthodox Islam? And then how do we combine that with this emerging youth movement that is the Black Power movement and this, you know, turn towards Afrocentricity and whatever else? The Dar didn't, it wasn't out of this vacuum where somebody just came and said, hey, you should do this, right?
No.
These are all of the things that are happening. I think it's even so significant of where they were in, you know, in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, in Bed-Stuy. These are all neighborhoods in Brooklyn that, you know, are predominantly Black working class neighborhoods that have really vibrant Black radical politics, you know, histories of community control. And the Dar is, they're interacting with those people, right? So this is important to think about them within that local social and political landscape as well.
Well, you know, one of the things that you have to remember is that some of the brothers that you saw in that picture were former Panthers, former BLA, former military personnel. So the people who had been gathered by the fervor of the Dar were people from that cross section of society where it was like they were, you know, they threw their hands up against the society. And so, you know, meeting brothers is like, oh, he used to be a Panther. Oh, he used to be this. He used to be that, you know, and he used to be a street gang. And, you know, and it was all sorts of people whom this dean had motivated to become brothers. Because had it been any way other than that, as the Quran says, we'd have been enemies.
That's right.
But the dean brought people together in a very warm situation. I tell you, listen, I was born and raised in Harlem. So to see brothers after a prayer, embrace and hug with warmth and sincerity, without any animosity, it was a real strange thing for me. I was like, wow, these guys got something different here. And it was very new to me, but it was very inspirational because you sit down and you say, this is real unique. And the lingo that the brothers had was one of brotherhood affinity, and it was immediately grasping. You know, one encounter you was in, not because you know you had been forced in, but you was like, I got to be a part of that. One of the things that really got me, again, I'm from Harlem, to see these at that time in my head was, man, these Negroes talking this different language. What the heck is this? This has got to be something unique. And then when you would hear Imam Yahya talk, Rahimullah, it was like, man, okay, I ain't gonna say this guy's divine, but he ain't like the rest of the people. He's not like the rest of the people. And when he spoke from his heart. And I used to love his fireside chats more than his standing teaching, because his fireside chats gave you a glimpse as to what he had in his heart and in his mind. And that's what made the difference. And so all of these things brought you together and made you brothers with people that you would have never imagined that you could be a brother with.
So can you say a little bit about how this pledge also helped facilitate that brotherhood, that inclusion, that sense of you are a part of this growing group, and there's obligations that we have towards one another?
Well, the pledge took place a certain thug or gang mentality of, you know, commitment and being in. But when this pledge came about, and this pledge was superior to anything off the street, you were pledging yourself to this group, this majlis, whose responsibility it was to develop, establish, and defend according to the Sharia. You first had to wrap your head around what is the Sharia, you know, because these were all new terms. It was a new term for me. It's like Sharia. Okay, what's that? And oh, this is what this is. This is the law of Islam. Okay, so it began to make sense, and it established a sense of a term that was introduced to us by Imam Yahya called Daruna. And Daruna meant our country or our nation. And so from the outset, you got somebody telling you that here we are a nation within a nation. We're a government within a government. We're a community inside of a community. We had a mindset for territory, and that was the mindset for territory where we could practice the Sharia in every aspect. And these were nuances that, again, a poor kid from Harlem, you know, I never heard of that. You know, this is a new thing. This is something that touches the souls of men in ways that they have never been touched. And then when you started learning more and more about the Prophet ﷺ, and then again, like I said, if you read a book like Milestones, it wasn't hard to say, I'm in to the end, because you began to realize that this ignorance, this form of lifestyle that we had and knew was not for us. It was something that was heaped upon us. Like Malcolm Rahimullah used to talk about, they took our language, they took our culture, they took our God, they took everything and replaced it with things that was hideous. And so with this pledge, it was like, okay, I can deal with this pledge. And that's what united all of these brothers and many, many more who were not in this picture.
That's right.
This picture was, I think, taken on a Saturday morning when Rod used to train, because it was a training day every Saturday and Sunday after Fajr. And part of the training would be, we used to run in military style and formation from Rockaway back to Brooklyn. That's why my feet don't work so good no more. But yes, it was a discipline that was like, man, this is real unique. Now this is brother Abdus-Salam Rahimullah. He was one of the brothers that worked very closely with Khalil Kabir in the audio visual department. They were responsible for videotaping or picture taking and audio taping the Imam's khutbahs. And those two youngsters there are the children of one of the brothers that was an administrator named Ibrahim bin Banu. These are the two of the bin Banu clan. And they're grown men now. But this is the printing press that we had acquired, trying to figure out, we got to print, we got to, do things ourselves. If we're not with communications, what are we doing? And this was part of the vision of the national spokesman for Dar-ul-Islam, Brother El-Hajj Ali Muhammad. rahimullah. And that was part of the vision that these brothers had. They all had visions of creating statehood, nationhood, to move forward. I think sometimes they may have even been before their time with some people, because some people kind of like, what are we gonna do with that? You know, because they didn't have an appreciation for printing and other things. But nonetheless, alhamdulillah, some of the work that was done is some of these magazines that you see here. El-Jihadul Akbar, subhanallah. It was the first of its kind. It was to be different from Muhammad Speaks at the time, because that was what was all over the place. Muhammad Speaks, Muhammad Speaks, Muhammad Speaks. One of the downfalls was that brothers kind of had a thing about selling this magazine, because they felt like, I ain't part of the nation, why we got to sell these magazines? And that was part of the shortfall of brothers whose vision, you know, just wasn't there. And so after about a year and a half, a year or so, Jihadul Akbar kind of phased out because of the lack of support. And so, yeah.
Yeah, but I wanted to show, and it's hard to see the text, but this is also these copies that are available on the Dar-ul-Islam collection website. Again, I think it's important to read what people themselves are writing about themselves, right? And so it's, here in the fine print says, regardless of titles, whether it's Dar-ul-Islam or whatever, it is one brotherhood, basically.
Yes.
Right? Al-Islam movement is just what it is. It is a movement, and one should realize that all of the rest of the brothers, regardless of what organization, they're a part of it, right? It is a movement towards the security of Islam, the abode of peace, safety within the realm of Allah's laws. It is establishment of Allah's laws, as in the precepts laid down by the Sharia of Quran and Hadith, and a movement in that direction. So, one of the things that I wanted to do was also to try to figure out how to download the text, right? So people can, again, understand how just monumental, right, it was for these young people to say, this is what we're about. We're calling ourselves a movement, but we're all brothers in Islam. This is what we're trying to do. And it says, what is the Dar-ul-Islam treaty that ties other groups to you? And so this is, bringing in, like, what is the pledge, how they're also adapting, right, from the hadith, from the tradition of the prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. Like, this is how now this applies to how we're living today, right? So this is also part of the Jihadul Akbar magazine. And so thinking about this idea of going to different cities, different places, how do we then extend and clarify what our connections are? So I think this is, again, like pulling out or lifting up what makes this unique within the context in which it's happening. Yes.
Oh, is it okay if I add something? I think also what is incredible is, so it's being printed where you see that printing press, right, in Brooklyn, but then it's being distributed to all of the DAR chapters all across the country, 30 to 40 different chapters, as well as the prisons where they have outreach with where they're doing their prison outreach, right? So it's going to these wide audiences. And in one of the editorials, it says, like, part of this is to kind of build consensus and shared knowledge. And, obviously now we think about social media and there's so many ways to connect, but this was, at the time, such an important way to kind of shape the vision of the movement, also create a space for dialogue and collective thinking and collective analysis. I think one of the things, at least for me, that was so incredible about the newsletter, not only, first of all, also, like, most of the articles don't even have names, because this is like, subhanAllah, I was like, oh, we want to make them anonymous so that like because we are all one collective, right? And any feedback or criticism or whatever is
Yeah.
directed. There's a level of humility there. But in addition to all of these like original pieces that are specifically about like even like there's this whole multi-series thing about Islam. And nowadays we think about, oh, is Islam anti-Black, like Arab slavery and all of this? There's literally articles in the 70s where folks in the Dar are debating and engaging this and creating these platforms. There's another article that I saw where they're reproducing the writings of Imam al-Ghazali about like children's education. And it doesn't say that it's from him, but it's like in the 1970s, Imam al-Ghazali's writings were not widely published in English. The first translation came out in the 90s. So yeah, exactly. So please, I don't know if you can share where those translations are coming from, but this is like not just the cultural movement, but like the intellectual like rigor and advancement and this global intellectual tradition that they're engaging.
Yes. And it says here at the top on the right side, Dar-ul-Islam used the historical Medina Treaty of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him, to further unify Muslims under one banner of Islam, right? There's no God but Allah, Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. Perhaps the sincere Muslims who want true leadership and unity will endorse a leader with this type of document as the means for individual and collective allegiance. Stop and think about your commitment before giving your word. Every Muslim, in order to establish Islam, should pledge his or her ability, love, energy, wealth, and life to Allah.
Yes.
I mean, it's such like tiny print, but like every page is packed, right, with this way of saying, this is what we're learning and this is what we're applying in real time, right, to our lives. And I wouldn't want anyone to think like this isn't this history, gathering of the history is not meant to be a glorification of all that went well, right? And sort of a minimization of those challenges. But it is to say, and this is drawn from a framework called appreciative inquiry, right? Which I've applied to Black Muslims. So Black Muslim appreciative inquiry is predicated on the fact that there are strengths, there's resilience, there's genius and creativity within a community, an organization, right, a society. And so what do we learn when we first ask the question, what are you doing well, right? As opposed to, well, what were the pitfalls and what were the problems and what was happening? We can run a list, right, of what those challenges might have been and to some degree still continue to be for our community. But we first have to, in this appreciative inquiry, which is rooted in positive psychology, which says people have knowledge, right? And they are wrestling in real time with what it means to not only survive, but thrive, right? To establish this idea of like spiritual sovereignty, right? Which is throughout all of the pages of Jihadul Akbar, which is we live in this hostile place, but we must create a territory for ourselves, right? Both physically and mentally, which says there's nothing greater than Allah, right? It's not white people, it's not, sort of different ideologies. Like our commitment, right? Our effort is to return to Allah, to establish this space where we can begin to think for ourselves, where Islam can answer some of the questions, right, of poverty, of war, of violence. And like the early community, it was one where regardless of whether or not you were Muslim, right, the immediate thought was, if I'm around Muslims, I'm protected, right? I'm safe, right? I know that there's like a code of conduct that people are living by. And so that is dawah in and of itself, right? There's no pressuring, right? But it's just curiosity, right? Like I'm not even Muslim and they make sure that I get home okay. They make sure the streets are safe. They make sure that the women aren't harmed. And I'm not even in their group, right? And so what would it mean for me to be a believer, right? What would it mean for me to then embrace this way of life? So that is really compelling, right? And I think for us, especially when we're also having to confront our own internalized sense of inferiority, right? Of self-hatred, of being told that we cannot govern ourselves, that we are in some way deficient, for these communities, right? Men, women, and children to say, no, we will govern ourselves. There is nothing that is greater than the God that we are worshiping. And this is how we're going to live our lives. I think it's just a really powerful statement. So I know we're already 15 after the hour, but I wanted to just briefly sort of highlight, and this is just a snapshot. But again, thinking about structure, discipline, organization, right? Like how the leadership was also structured to give people sort of local autonomy, right? But to say, you know, who are we looking to for guidance? And with this structure here as well, it's people have different abilities, right? They have different expertise, they have different strengths. And so let's leverage all of the strengths of the community. And it's knowing like, what can this brother or this sister do well, right? If she was a public school teacher, she could teach our kids, right? She has the credentials, she's, you know, she has the certification to do so. So I think this is also very, very significant. And I want to mention here, we're going to talk a little bit about Bilal Abdul-Rahman. I was saying to a sister earlier, I think everybody has a Bilal in their family, and it's not just because, you know, companion of the Prophet, of course, but my older brother Bilal, my son Bilal, right? And for me, it I don't know. One day it just clicked. I was like, oh, the origin of it is much closer than I had even considered, right? It's Big Brother Bilal, right? Abdul-Rahman. And so, you know, thinking about like my son's name is Ismail, right? And I'm like, oh my goodness, right? Even sort of the way that the culture of the Dar is then influencing how we name our children, right? Who are they connected to in terms of like lineage, right? Whether directly or indirectly, I think is really important. So one of the, I think, sort of significant contributions of the Dar is also all of the ways that, you know, it's like, how do we generate income for this sovereign community, right? So halal meat market, when people think about sort of the brothers selling incense and oils, right? That's Dar, right? So what are you going to say? I can see you.
No, I remember this picture. This was the first. When by Allah's mercy, we were able to establish halal meats in downtown Brooklyn. And I think it was one of the first in the country, because not everybody was talking or thinking about halal meat. You know, people was doing whatever. And one of the intellectual engineers of that was the brother that you see there, Muhammad Ahmed. He was the Minister of Finance, Rahimullah. And, you know, when you started meeting these brothers, it was like, man, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put a lot of high-powered thinkers inside this community that we never saw or thought we would see, and particularly in lawful business and trade. And but this institution of the halal meat market, being the first, we established it right downtown in Arab Town on Court Street. And I think it kind of set the trend for everybody wanting to do halal foods at some point. But the origins of it, you know, a lot of people don't realize it. And I say this humbly, that most people today owe a sense of gratitude first to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for allowing a ragtag bunch of people coming together called Dar-ul-Islam and establishing a platform whereby people could operate and establish this deen.
But
Very much.
what year was the meat market established? Do you remember?
73.
Okay. Okay.
1973.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so,
And you know, it became something that the community supported, because we dared not go to some other place to buy to buy anything. It was a first because that's when we started learning about the Zabia, slaughtering these animals, and the care that we're supposed to have with regards to the production of the food that we would eat.
that's right.
And it was to generate revenue for inside the community. So it was multifaceted for a lot of different things. And it was all brought together by that one piece of paper, the Medina Treaty. Now, one of the interesting things about the Medina Treaty, it was because it was really like a constitution that the Prophet ﷺ had. And it was the first known written constitution in the world, because no other grouping had ever had a constitution that was designed to bring all sorts of variant people together. And it was the wisdom of the Imam and those around him to incorporate that, to gather the brothers and sisters inside of the neighborhoods and throughout the country to be a part of this effort to establish this deen so that we can return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That was a conscious and well thought out endeavor. And alhamdulillah, we live by it. We live by it. And so
Someone just told me that the chat is disabled. So if you do have a question or a comment, just put it in the Q&A section. I wanted to move through the timeline pretty quickly. This information is on the website, thepeopleseffort.com. But I thought it was important that we talked through, right, some of these important, and not everything is here, right? I mean, we could be on this call all day, but some of the highlights. And I think when we talk about the growth of the Dar over those years, it's also about the influence on culture, right? Like how people are dressing, how they're speaking, even using sort of tabligh as a verb, right? Like we're going to these places like, and tabligh can be, but it's like the language that I think some people still use that originated in the Dar.
yes, yes.
I think it's Dr. Sawad Abdul-Kabir that talks about this Black Arabic, right? And the ways that Black people are sort of, they're saying like, we don't mix a lot. It's like, wait, that's how we're speaking, right? And then it's sort of becoming, again, a sort of a signal of the community that you belong to, right? And then it's also, in some ways, people are borrowing, right, from each other, right? And so I understood what that word meant, but it was going back into like Jihadul Akbar and sort of reading these articles. I'm like, we're doing something here, even in language, right? And then explaining to people what those things mean. So this is a very sort of brief timeline, and sort of pulls out, again, some of those significant moments through 2024. But what I wanted to do on thepeopleseffort.com is sort of listed in this way, right? So what's sort of happening, right, in sort of the background and the context of the Dar, but what's also happening in the country, right, or internationally. And with that understanding, right, it's March 1960 is the Vietnam War, right? United States announces that American soldiers will be sent to Vietnam. So many Black men were sent to Vietnam, were drafted, and did not come back the same, right? This is also September 1960. He's now Cassius Clay, right? Wins the gold medal in boxing. And then he becomes a Muslim, right? And so we see ways that people are being influenced, right? But are also influencers on the history. Another sort of pivotal moment, 1965, Malcolm X is assassinated. And in Jihadul Akbar, July 1974, Imam Yahya says the Sunni Muslim brothers, right? And he says the indigenous Orthodox Muslim brothers were hoping that Malcolm would come to us, right? Come directly over into Sunni Islam. But as is known, Malcolm started his own particular thing. He established a Muslim Mosque Incorporated. none of the people affiliated with him at that time became an active part of our community. Again, there was still respect, even if it was, okay, this person, right, is establishing their own thing. And I think the general message being sent is nobody has a monopoly on this, right? Like the community needs Islam, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, if this is being established specifically, and again, in order to propagate that life-giving message, the more messengers, right, that we have in the community, the better. And so this is also taken from 1974 on the right, the community regroups, right? And so you see the sort of the early formation of the community coming together. There's disagreements. There's people saying, oh, no, we should do it this way or that way, right? There's regroup, there's splintering. But this doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, right? There are people who are thinking through what it means to be Muslim. So 1966, community continues to grow slowly in Brownsville, East New York, where I grew up, right? Picken Avenue, close to Saratoga. It says some folks, and this was taken, I think, from Black Pilgrimage to Islam, some folks in the neighborhood begin to refer to Dar members as baldies, right? Because they're wearing a kufi, right? It's like, what's happening under the kufi, under the turban? And again, these markers of distinction, of identification are very important, even psychologically, when we think about the structure of belonging, right? How do I know I'm a part of that group, right? Well, they look like me. We have a similar language. We have a similar lifestyle. And this is really important in terms of like group identification and cohesion. So again, in 1967, so what I'm attempting to do in the timeline, and it's not complete, right? So I'm still sort of adding this context, is for people to understand that the brothers and this movement, the women, the children are not growing in isolation. So you see here in 1968, when Imam Yahya is elected Imam, but you also have in 1968, all of this happening, right? Martin Luther King is assassinated, there's riots, Robert Kennedy is assassinated. There's the 1968 Summer Olympics, where, you know, the iconic photo of the brothers with their fists raised. All of this is happening, right, at the same time. And so this is important. There's an article that I was able to find in the archives, FBI men hunt draft evader. So there was, you know, talking about, you know, maybe he was a member of the Dar.
Yes.
A refuge in the Masjid, right? And so what did this mean, again, for the FBI to raid, right, a sovereign place, right? What did it mean for people to find protection within the community, and that protection to actually mean something? Abu, did you want to say something about that moment?
It was a tough one. I tell you, you know, when they decided to kick the doors down of the masjid, claiming to be looking for draft dodgers that they never were able to furnish anything concretely about. Several brothers ended up being arrested because when they kicked the door, and I don't think they realized that they were going to meet resistance that they met. And so some of these so-called very strong and well-trained FBI agents, to coin a phrase, got their butts whipped, and deservingly. And they had to realize, okay, you don't do that. You know, you want to come and bring a supervisor and you talk seriously. You just don't come kicking doors down with weapons drawn, because there could be women and children here. And they didn't have that concern. You know, all you had to do was think about what was going on with the Panthers at that time. They didn't care. When they decided to make a move, they made a move.
Right.
And, you know, by Allah's mercy, nobody got shot and hurt or killed. But these people were very poised to implement the policies of their COINTEL program.
That's right.
And that was a part of what afflicted the movement. You know, I firmly believe that what brought about the demise of the movement was the end result of COINTELPRO. They figured they couldn't get in any other way than to be pretentious about presenting someone who could say, you don't know what you're doing, I need to tell you how to do it. And I was at a conference in Virginia, down in Richmond, a year or two ago, and there was some young brothers who had left the Fuqra, and they were voicing some of their dismay about what was going on. And so they asked me, what did I think about when Jelani came along and began to advocate certain things. And one of the things he advocated was he hoodwinked brothers. And he hoodwinked them with this idea, we're going to go to jihad in Afghanistan. And I sat down and said to somebody, I said, listen, this ain't nothing but the 52 fake out, man. What we going to Afghanistan for? And we got a rumble right here. This is a 52 fake out. Y'all need to realize it. Need to say at that point was when I was driven out from the movement, because I at no point thought that Jelani was anything other than a charlatan. And to at that point to do that, there was a lot of anxiety in the hearts of people, because some of them, for whatever reason, believed that he was, if nothing else, I think they thought that he was divine. But that was the joke. That was the 52 fake out, and I wasn't going for it. And there was a bunch of us that didn't go for it. And we fought back the best way we could, and that fighting back was resistance, not being a part of, and trying to talk to some of our peers who began to immediately shut down and not communicate. It had gotten so bad at one point, and I tell this as a very disheartening reality. We got to the point where one year, one Juma, I think it was, I went to pray for Juma, and was denied access to the Masjid. And I prayed in the street. In my mind, like, you're not going to search me. That's not going to happen. You're not going to do this, that, or the third. So if you want to search somebody, you want to take something from somebody, you better go back inside and get it from one of them, because it's not happening out here. And I had my musalla mat with me, and I prayed, 4 rakats right there and left.
So I want to lift up another turning point, but also want to kind of prepare you, right? A turning point being the assassination of Brother Bilal Abdul-Rahman. And we've talked about it, but those being moments, right, that also are important to understanding the context, right? Like how things, what is sort of the atmosphere, right? What are people also living with at the time that's impacting the movement? So this is actually taken from the New York Times.
Okay.
I think one of the early sort of mentions of the Dar, right? So this is January 26, 1973, because to most people, it was like all these Black people running around calling themselves Muslims. We don't even know, right? There's some Muslims that are doing that. And right, so there's not a very sophisticated understanding of even sort of the nuance of the communities that are growing. But here was an early mention, right? That for the last 3 years in a 3-story building at 52 Herkimer Place in Bedford-Stuy, Dean Mosque has been a gathering spot and place of worship for a growing number of predominantly Black Brooklynites who have converted to Orthodox Islam and become Sunni Muslims. So this, for me, was actually pretty significant in the archives, because it's describing with a little bit more specificity, right, what this community is. And this is also starting to include how the community is influential. And so here it's describing how Brother Bilal is a part of, there was sort of a hostage scene that's happening in Brooklyn at a sporting goods store.
Broadway, yeah.
And sort of his intervention, which actually gains the respect, right, of the people that he was able to intervene. So it says Minister Abdullah Rahman and 3 other mosque officials said this week that the 4 men may have prayed at the mosque, but were not known to mosque officials. He stressed that the action that they are accused of did not accurately portray the beliefs of the Yassin community. The Yassin, along with the larger Dar-ul-Islam movement, of which it is a part, is one of the many mostly Black groups of converts to Islam who exhibit sharp differences that are partly mirrored among the Brooklyn groups. And so it goes on to describe some aspects of the Dar. And this is, I think, significant again, because it's not coming from Jihadul Akbar, right? It's a
Right.
report from the New York Times. What happens almost a year later, right, is this, is the assassination, February 4th of 1974. And now, because it's being represented as almost like these Muslim groups are now killing each other, there's like almost like this internal combustion, right? So some of the articles, and this is picked up by the Associated Press, so it's all around the country that this is happening. You see basically the same article being reprinted in like Nebraska, right? And so people are getting now an image or a story about the Dar that's maybe this was sort of the catalyst for what they begin to know. And so it's significant that the movement has lost Bilal Abdurrahman, who's the second, right, in command. And also, as you mentioned, Brother Muhammad Ahmed, who's like the finance wizard. He's the one thinking about how does the community support itself, and you know, again, able to establish like its own revenue and income so that it is independent. So Jihadul Akbar is writing, right, about this moment. And this is taken from, I believe, the August 1974 issue. And what I wish I could find is this picture. I don't know if folks can see in the background on the chalkboard. Islam is not a game. And I was like, this, again, it was, you can see in the way that the members are presenting themselves, like, this is serious, right? We are.
That was a lecture at the 74th precinct, I believe it was, 74th or 75th precinct, and their gang division unit, because they were trying to understand what was going on inside the Muslim community. And so Bilal Rahimullah made it a point to put on their board, Islam is not a gang. So you can't refer to it that way. And his presence, I think, kind of petrified, because all the people, all the officers that was there was all white. And obviously they had their own biases, but his presence was a commanding one. When he spoke, you listened. And he had them, and they listened, and they understood. And this took place before the event that you showed with the four brothers on out in Bushwick on Broadway with the gun store and that event. Because Bilal Rahimullah was, he was, everybody knew him as Big Brother. They were calling him Big Brother, Big Bilal. And people loved him throughout every part of Brooklyn that he ever set foot in and through. They knew him as a person that represented the utmost aspect of religion, and particularly among the Muslims. And he was well loved. And when he passed, he was well missed equally.
One of the sort of the texts here that I wanted to lift up was, so this is an interview that was done with him, and he says, being a part of this movement and seeing brothers making prayer together and coming together for Friday services, one can see the propagation of the religion open up avenues for Muslims, such as employment, services in the prisons, people getting the correct viewpoint of what Islam is and what it is not. For once, we see the election of an imam by the people, whereas one cannot assume the position of leadership by jumping up and saying, I am this place. And so, you know, what I think, you know, even as at the top, it says freedom of religion is a right that we have to practice. What I also think is really compelling about this interview is that you get also a little bit of backstory about who these people are. Right. So he was born in Florida to the Kinch family on August 8th, 1937. This is also, I think, a wealth of information that we don't have on of the leaders, both men and women, early founders of the movement. So memorializing his death, and I think also explaining to people what this means. So writing like that he who is killed in self-defense is a martyr, right? And so even using that language around the deaths of these two men in particular, that they, that they are elevated, right? That they are martyrs. I think this is, again, sort of introducing an understanding of how you're living, right, in this place, and it is connected to a longer tradition in which you see these kinds of events happening.
Just one thing I think in just building on this idea of how loved they were, the school that they established in 1974 was initially called something else, and then they renamed it, and it's opening to Madrasa to Shahidain, the school for the two martyrs.
Yes.
Exactly, specifically talking about Brother Bilal Abdullah and Brother Muhammad Ahmed, the two who were martyred. And so that legacy, lives on in that way as well.
That's right. That's right. And also, the songs that are written about the madrasa that the children are singing. So I can hear it in my mind, right? It's like Madrasa to Shahidain, oh, what a beautiful name. I can't remember like all of the words. But again, highlighting the fact that the history of the movement is also being taught as it's happening.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So children know, right? Like, what do you belong to, right? And in my interviews, I would ask people like, how did you know you were part of the Dar? Maybe that word, like, oh, we're a part of this movement, wasn't spoken of like specifically, but it's like, oh, we knew, right? Like there was a difference. When I showed a picture of like 4-year-old me with a kimar on, right? That was one indicator, right? And so, the way that children and the role of women in being able to sort of cultivate this community, right, of care, of education, is really important. So what I noticed about, again, a photo from the Dar-ul-Islam collection, is that you see Black women here, right, who are dressed in very different ways, right? So some are wearing the parda, the face veil, some are wearing turbans. You have here a woman who has a shaved head. And I was like, this is, again, such a moment that is being captured about sort of the range, right, of the people who are a part or at least in proximity to the community. And so there's a whole issue about women in Islam, June 1974. And again, sort of capturing, I remember when I used to wear my kimar this way too, it's like sort of capturing like how are the girls also being, socialized into this way of life. So again, this is taken, you can sort of start to read some of the text. Some of it is a response to sort of white feminism, right, in the 1970s, like that ain't for us, that's for them people, right? This is what Islam teaches us. And so we're getting, right, images of women, says mothers of the believers, right, studying Islamic principles. Here it says Washington Islamic Center, where Muslim women are at a bazaar given by Dar-ul-Islam, right? Here's a sister in a turban. Here's a sister, right? I mean, so you start to see like the ways that women are also making the movement their own. And so the question that I had, because some of the most sort of iconic pictures of the Dar, right, are of the rod, right, the sort of that long, capture moment of the men, but what of the women, right? So thinking about where are the stories, and so this was taken from Dr. Kamal Ali's history of the Dar, right? So Muslim women who through their sacrifice, sound judgment, and piety, as well as their unmitigated inner strength and fortitude, accounted for much of the programmatic success of the Dar-ul-Islam movement. Their work was emblematic of the adage that no society flourishes unless the role of its women is valued and honored. He went on to say, to a large degree, the organization, preparation, and hosting of community fundraisers was the bailiwick of the Dar Sisterhood, and the Amir of Education was assisted by a cadre of dedicated, compassionate volunteers, nearly all of whom were women. And so I think this is, That's significant. So my question, right, and to me, I know you're sort of like wrestling with what does it mean for the women, especially in the area of education, when that is such an important role. How do you educate the children, especially in order to sustain this movement so that they're knowledgeable, not just about sort of the principles of the faith, but about themselves? So the question that sort of I pose in this work is, we must also have the stories and perspectives of women in order to round out holistically, right, this understanding. So this was, again, you see here from the Dar-ul-Islam collection, the women, right, sort of dressed in a very particular style. And so one sister said, well, women created space for each other in community life. And she said, you know, speaking of like her mother and sort of the other elder sisters, you're not going to trip the elders on Tawheed. They are so sure that he, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is there. He is real, he is kind and merciful, and he will do what he is supposed to do if you do what you're supposed to do. And so it was like her way of emphasizing that there was this eagerness of the women also to learn Islam for themselves. From a brother, a former Dar member, who said, Dar sisters were very strong in face of difficulty and hardships imposed on them due to brothers' unemployment. Again, thinking about the time, right? Brothers coming back from war, there's incarceration, there's violence in the community. He said, now Dr. Ali said, you know, significant, right? Or much of the programmatic success. And this brother said 99% of the women's efforts contributed to the success. And sisters believed that they were helping the man, and this was part of the struggle. Women believed that they were part of the revolution. And then finally, another sister said, women believed Allah provides. They said Bismillah and did the best they could with what they had. And the way they love Islam and love Allah brings them peace. So I wanted to go back to this picture here because you can see in the background, it says, welcome to the madrasa. And Dr. Samiha, in your work, what are some of the themes that you're connecting around education and community building and the legacy of how women are doing this in a very particular way?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is, so this is initially, so before the school started in 1973, first there was the child care facility. So even this idea we have of the Dar, yes, it was a lot of young people. And it was also, but they were still thinking intergenerationally, right? They were thinking this is not just for the young adults and the adult members of the community to learn this knowledge, but we need to create these zones of peace, these sacred geographies, literally from the earliest of our members. And so they created this childcare center. And then based on the childcare center, there was a summer program. And then from that, there was a proposal that actually Dr. Kamal Hassan Ali himself wrote for the school. And the thing that was really significant about that is that this school was a response to, specifically, they're living in Ocean Hills, Brownsville, Bed-Stuy, East New York, all spaces that you know, are suffering from New York City's public schools. And these are spaces where for a long time, Black communities have been saying our students are being miseducated. How do we properly educate them? Reading levels, it says in the proposal, are so low. We have, you know, a friend here now. Reading levels are so low. So how do we create this alternative space for our children? And the thing that's really significant, at least for me, thinking about this present moment, is when we think about Muslim schools in the US, we typically think about Sister Clara Muhammad schools, which, you know, are inheriting some of the legacy of the Nation of Islam and the University of Islam, which again was thinking about women, was started by Sister Clara Muhammad in 1934. And she was educating her own children at a time when homeschooling was not legal. And literally cops showed up to her house, threatened to arrest her unless she put her children in public schools. And she said something along the lines of, I will literally die at this door rail than send my children to your schools. So this was a long history of Black Muslims of being interested in self-determination, having the right to educate themselves. And you see this with the Dar, right? But they opened their school in 1974. They're probably the first Sunni Muslim, Black American Sunni Muslim run school. They predated, the transition of the nation under Imam Yahya Muhammad. And it was the work of these women. Like just the part where it says that they were and all volunteer staff, let's spell that out. These were people who were not being paid to
at
run
all.
a school from I don't know, my kids go to school from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. and then there's after school, the childcare facility. There's an ad in Jihadul Akbar. I think it said it was like open from like 7 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. or something, and you're not getting paid, right? So like a lot of this work is really essential, and women are doing it, and they're doing it as a part of understanding that to really build healthy, vibrant communities, we need to be doing that intergenerational learning and this type of education. And it was primarily for the families in the Dar, but it was also open to non-Muslims too, right?
Yes,
Like
it
how
was.
do we serve, how do we serve the people? How do we offer Black families in New York City who are thinking about the poor quality of public education? How do we offer them spaces that are really nurturing and affirming? And then just to think about the present, I know, for example, Ustada Ruqayya Yaqub and others have been thinking a lot about how present day Muslim schools, if they're not part of the Sister Clara Muhammad tradition, for Black students, if they're in immigrant run schools, there's often a lot of, instances of anti-Black racism, and just they're not nurturing spaces. And so when we think about what can we learn in this present day, this untold story, this overlooked aspect is so significant because this is the Sister Clara Muhammad schools are part of a broader landscape of Black American Muslims creating their own schools to have these nurturing safe havens where young people can not only learn about their histories and identities as Muslims of African descent, they can learn about Islam, they can be really nurtured and cultivated. And so I think the school is really incredible. There was more than almost 200 students by the 79-80 year. Again, 200 students, almost 30 staff members, women not being paid. Like I think all of this is a really significant, just speaks to their level of sacrifice and dedication and commitment to really, self-reliance in terms of thinking about how do we create this world that we want to see for ourselves and how do we do it from, I think it was like as young as 6 months or whatever the child, however, I think it was 6
It was
months or
about
less.
6 months.
Yeah, exactly. So how do we do that from the very, very start? And another thing I think is important is thinking about why do you need a child care facility for somebody who's 6 months, for a child who's 6 months old? Because the parents are also doing things, right? So also creating these institutions from the schools to the incense and oil factories to all these things. What are ways in which we can support our families economically, but then also in this childcare context, offer them the resources and support to actually go do the work on behalf of the movement?
Yes, absolutely. And this is all going in your book?
No,
Kameelah,
this is a separate thing, but yes, inshallah, so.
do you see the sister at the door
Yes,
receiving the child?
yes.
You know who that is?
Should I know? I can't remember.
You communicate with her daughter all the time. That's Kameelah Babur's mother,
No way.
Sister Tenora.
Wow.
Yep. Yes, that's her.
Wow.
Way back then, yes.
Oh,
Yeah. She was probably one of them babies in there at that time.
yes.
And they was sitting there doing what they did, fi sabilillah, with the higher objective in mind, not worried about how we're going to do it, what finances were necessary, but we're going to make the sacrifice to save the kids. One of the things New York City did, they forced us to have the kids enter into one of their school competitions.
Mm.
And they had a battery of questions that they would ask, and they were shocked that the children from Shahidain were running neck and neck with these public school kids.
Mm-hmm.
And so what they did, they inserted a question that they figured that would be a stumbling block. And that question was, they asked them about music. And the kids was like, music? these groups, and the kids couldn't answer it. And so they lost their title because of that.
Wow. I didn't know that.
Because the children were not into, you know, the way some kids are now. These kids had no idea. They were not given to that. They were trying to learn Quran and Hadith and trying to be disciplined. But that was one of the tricks that the city played.
Wow.
But it didn't matter because everybody knew that the loss was really a victory and that the knock was a boost. And so they didn't demand anybody to show back up at any of their competitions because they knew that they were losing all the time. But I just thought that you would find that kind of interesting to know that the person you're working with all the time, that's her mother.
In the photo. But the last, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I feel so indebted to Sister Kameelah Barber for a lot of, I don't know if this is where you got a lot of the Jihadul Akbar copies that I've read. It's because of the Dar-ul-Islam collection that she's maintaining.
Yes.
So even thinking about this work, like being in that photo, and then now as a grown adult being really one of the driving engines behind making all this information accessible, that and this is why the oral histories are so important too, because they tell us the stories that haven't been written down. People can narrate in their own lives, but the very few written archival sources we have are from Jihadul Akbar, which in most places haven't been digitized. And her website, I think, is one of the only places that they are digitized. So it's an incredible resource.
And she was the moving force behind the Dar-ul-Islam project. Not a problem. Her father had the material, but she said, Abu, we gotta put this out there. And so every time I see her, I always talk to her like, I'm glad you did what you did, because she had the enthusiasm to do that and the vision and the aspiration, and alhamdulillah, now we have a collection.
Yes.
That far exceeds anything different. So that's why I said I love daughters, because daughters do a lot. I love them.
The women who volunteer and labor and make the sacrifices.
They do a lot.
But in this final section, I wanted to, again, part of a core aspect of the People's Effort project that I led was really trying to map the communities, right? And so we hear, when I was thinking about like, how are we citing this reference to somewhere between 30 and 40 communities? I was like, where do we track the source of that? How do we know that to be true? And so started to think about how can we begin to, people say, well, I was a part of a community in upstate New York. I was a part of a community in Baltimore. I was a part, right? Like, how do we begin to really diligently, right? Think about what are the names, who were the leaders at the time? And this was taken from an article from the Columbus Inquirer, and actually received a picture of this from Mubaraka Ibrahim. It's actually her mother, Sister Tia, may all be pleased with her, who's in the photo. And Mubaraka tells me, my mother is pregnant with me in that photo.
Subhanallah.
And then the brother on the right, Abu Jamil, Sister Yagatullah tells me today, she's like, I saw it, right, when you put it in the newsletter, and that's my grandfather. Right. And so it's like all of these ways that we're connected to this history. So mapping the communities are important, again, because, this headline says Muslims came to Alvaton, this is in Georgia, to live as the prophets. Right. Again, so this effort to return to Allah, to return to the Sunnah. And again, it might be difficult to see it in the fine print, but they're saying like it says the Ibrahims are Black and Muslim, but they are not to be confused with the militant Black Muslim sect polarized by Elijah Muhammad, right? So people are still trying to figure out, what are these Muslims doing? Right? But again, I think this is an important find, because it's, again, telling the story of how people are trying to live out their lives. So, just through, again, sort of anecdotal sort of conversations with you and with other people, it's like, well, if we start to map out, right, where these communities are, whether they're officially affiliated, right, or in some affiliation with the DAR, there's influence happening, right, and this doesn't capture all of the locations, but it's what I'm attempting to do with this history project is let's also document the places, because when you have information about those places, you also start to see the local influence, right?
Yeah.
And the ways that, again, the Muslims who moved to Georgia, right, and to maybe a rural area are originally from New York, right? And then they go back to New York and maybe they go to Massachusetts, right? And so there's also this, again, this idea of hijra, right, of migration to a place where we can live autonomously, we can live with some degree of sovereignty, and that is a really compelling idea, right? And so I think, you know, as the project grows, and I'm curious to connect with other people for whom, you know, it's like, yes, there was a Dar community somewhere in Texas, and we haven't really, you know, identified who was a part of it or how it grew or expanded or shifted, you know, transitioned to a different community later on. But these are, I think, important, really important details. Some of the key takeaways I'm going to mention, and then also Abu and Dr. Samiha, I want you to weigh in. Some of the things that I think are ongoing conversations are about the way the movement dissolves, how it's reconfigured, right? Sort of present day, sort of iterations of the Dar. But also, I think for me, like as a psychologist, is thinking about what is also the unresolved sort of grief and trauma around how the community dissolves, the way it fractures, right? Because this is also a movement of families. So these, you know, people aren't strangers to one another. So those who decide to break away, right, and not follow Jelani, what does it mean when that fracturing might happen actually within a family, right? How difficult, you know, I notice for some to sort of think retrospectively, right? Because it was such a moment in their lives that, you know, you can't sort of talk about it in a clinical way, right? Like, so what happened when, and what's the dates? But it's also like, this was a really profound moment of my life. And there's certain sort of reverberations, even 30, 40 years later, right? Another sort of observation was about the class differences, right, within the movement, how people then, as they are now, struggled with mental health issues, with addiction, with poverty, with unemployment. And so these tensions, again, are also showing up within the movement. There was also the practice of polygamy or polygyny, and again, an early community in which this is a practice, and you know, women are sort of negotiating, right, and sort of children as well, with what the practice meant. So you know, as I said from the outset, it's not to say, oh, look at all of these wonderful things, but also just, you know, these are human beings, right? These are for the most part, young people who are also grappling with like life, right? And so children, fatherhood, motherhood, these are also, you know, people who are embracing Islam and maybe the first in their family, right, to embrace Islam. So what does it mean to sort of now create family, like a chosen family within the Dar, to support the raising of children, when there might have been parents who were very vocally opposed, right, to this lifestyle. You know, why are you all covered in that stuff? Why are you wearing that thing on your head? You know, almost like being excommunicated from one's family of origin, and then having to find a path, right, to deal with the estrangement that would have happened, the loss of parental support because of the choice of Islam in this life. So there's a lot, I think, sort of psychologically and socially that we're still having to contend with in the present, because it has its sort of ripple effect down the line, right? And so not only the early converts in the Dar, but their children. Right now, there's like 3, 4, 5 generations, right, of Black Muslims. And so what are some of the ongoing sort of influences that we still have to wrestle with. I don't think any of this is sort of like resolved, but it remains an open question. And I think the part of the approach to being able to understand, getting closer, right, to understanding is knowing the history, right? Why did that happen that way? What were the stories I told about sort of the fracturing of communities? How were people attempting to repair, right, some of those wounds 40, 50 years later? So those were some of, I think, the observations that have stuck with me, right, is that when we talk about a movement, we also have to remember that these are ordinary people who are really, really striving under pretty tremendously hostile conditions, doing the best they can, and, right, still, there's still sort of areas of growth, of improvement, but also I think contemplation for what that struggle teaches us today. So Dr. Samiha, I want to get your final thoughts, and then Ebu, I want you to sort of close us out.
Yeah, I think this has been really incredible, this back and forth between the history and then just the lived experiences from El-Hajj Ali. So thank you so much for sharing. It's like the wealth of knowledge is incredible. And then the sharpness of memory, right? Like that was that person in that month, in that year, on that street. So
Right.
yeah, no, that's incredible. I think a couple of takeaways for me, and we started to kind of get into it with talking about the eventual breakup of the Dar and, you know, the community that went with Sheikh Mubarak Jilani. I think one idea that is really important, and I think especially for us to think about today, is this idea that the Dar had of imamakum minkum, of the leaders from amongst ourselves.
Yes.
And thinking about this idea of education, I remember there was an article in Jihadul Akbar about proper education and defining what is a proper education, right? And part of it was Islamic, but it was also like this idea of empowering yourself. And it actually specifically said we need to empower ourselves so that, and learn Islam for ourselves so that we are not taken away by charlatans and things like that, right?
Mhm.
So this idea is really important of thinking about education and specifically Islamic knowledge, not only as a path to liberation, but also as a path to religious authority and autonomy and building that knowledge and scholarly expertise among Black Americans. So, I mean, you know, obviously, I think that split was traumatic for a lot of people, and a lot of people found a lot of value in this new path that they went along. But I think overall, and this is, you know, something Sheikh Yahya Abdul-Kareem, who ultimately, you know, became a student of Sheikh Mubarak Jilani, but one of his early ideas was that we need a leader from amongst ourselves. And this is something that was constantly reiterated.
Mhm.
And I think it's really important to kind of hold that idea, regardless of what ultimately happened, as a really important takeaway. And then I think the other important takeaway is like just the concept of Dar-ul-Islam versus Dar-ul-Harb. Like Dar-ul-Islam, they defined it as this place of peace, right? The zone of peace. In contrast to Dar-ul-Harb, which is a space of war. We think about the United States context. We know, and they knew in the 60s, the U.S. was at war, had already, you know, engaged in genocidal warfare with indigenous people, was at war with Black people, was at war with Muslims, was at war with poor people, was at war with so many communities.
Mhm.
And within that, how instead of, you know, and this is part of the era of Black power, right? The shift away from civil rights of let's try and find, you know, spaces of integration and, you know, full democratic participation. How do we, like you said, create a nation within a nation? How do we build out our own safe harbors, what I would even call like these urban sacred geographies, and how do we actually do it in the hood, right? Ultimately, obviously, there were all these rural communities, but initially this idea, and you know, you talked about with those early news articles, Islam and its connection to the poor, to the downtrodden, and this community emerging because of this distinct love for the people, and the people being primarily working class Black folks in urban centers, you know? And so they were creating these spaces that we're not going to rely on the government, and we're not going to rely on the cops for safety, right? Like none of this stuff. We're going to create our own autonomous spaces where we can try to live as best as we can fully as Muslims, and then in so doing create this radical, you know, social transformation. So I think those two things for me are really important, knowing that these were ideas that ultimately were revised as the movement kind of ended in that iteration, but also were kept alive with Imam Jamil and, you know, his community in the West End. So these were things that, you know, the inheritors of the Dar continue to think about and, you know, continue to think about to the present day.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Oh, and also just one thing, I don't know if everybody saw the news, but Imam Jamil, the Innocence Project has taken on his case. So
Right.
inshallah, maybe that means that he will be liberated soon. So please keep.
Inshallah. That would be monumental if he was, because what he picked up on, and Imam Jamil, most people don't know, was in Bayat to Dar-ul-Islam as well. And he was appointed as the regional wali or governor of the South. And that was one good thing that happened, because when Jelani came along, the communities of the Dar that was affected the most were the northern communities because of travel from DC, Maryland, Jersey, Philadelphia, into New York, and so forth. Those southern communities, that was a pretty long haul for them to do. So there wasn't a lot of back and forward to HQ. And as a result, when the split did take place, they were very open to trying to figure out, what are we going to do now? And so those of us who were still in the North, we said, well, listen, let's get together with those that are not, those communities that are disinfected, and let's regroup, let's rethink. And so there was a conversation that was had, and that conversation was on a national level. What could we do? Who could we align with that understands us and we understand them, that will allow us to continue to function as an organized group? And it was at that point realized that we would go to Atlanta and we would sit down, and there would be a council of different imams and groups and so forth. And it was at that point that Imam Jamil was elected to be the new head of the disaffected members of Dar-ul-Islam. And so we did that. We met in Atlanta, and then we went to an outlying area in Georgia, wooded area. We sat down. We were far removed from, as I would call, civilization, because there was nobody out there but trees and cows and stuff. Is like, okay, we are really out here. And so, you know, that was our effort to try to regroup, to try to figure out what to do and how to salvage what we had started.
Okay.
And that was an endeavor that allowed the situation to take place, and that empowered Imam Jamil to serve now as the new leader of the communities that were disinfected. At that point, there was no aspiration to reclaim the title Dar-ul-Islam. That never took place.
Okay.
Different titles came up, but none of them that echoed that this is Dar-ul-Islam, unaffected by that thing.
Okay.
And so then it turned into being El-Ummah, and that's where it exists now. And very unfortunately, El-Ummah has suffered some setbacks, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will let that prevail however he does. So the thoughts that we had about Dar-ul-Islam was vast. It was devastating when the movement broke up. Kameelah and I have had endless conversations about the whys, the how comes, the whatnots, and and my only explanation to her was Dar-ul-Islam had a lifespan, and it lived this lifespan, and it did what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had willed it to do, and that was to lay the foundation for Islam on the Sunnah to be established in America. And that we did. Obviously, some of us think that there was failures in that, but Allahu Alam. I think, like I said earlier, I think everybody who practices Islam in America now owes a huge debt to Dar-ul-Islam and what was established. I tell most, I think I told all my kids at one point, I remember how I lost a job because the people I was working for came in the bathroom and they saw me with my foot in the sink because I was making wudu. And this guy came to me and said, Muhammad, what the hell are you doing? I said, man, I'm washing my foot. I'm getting ready to pray. And this fella said, okay, well, you just go ahead and pray. And when you're done, you can go home too. We'll get you checked. Not a problem. And my thought was, you got to threaten me with something I'm afraid of. I'm not afraid of you threatening me with this job, And the look on this person's face was like, how dare I respond in such fashion? But my thought was, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is my sufficiency, and I'm not worried about this because, if it's for me to have another job, to do something else, it'll come, But those were some of the struggles. I remember having gotten a job working for RCA Global Communications. And there was a lot of us that worked at RCA Global Communication because of a brother who is now deceased, Ali Abdul-Rashid. He was the Wazir of Tabligh. And he had gotten a lot of his jobs there. And he was a union rep. And when it was time for Juma, these people used to look around and, we was making flight, getting out of that building, going back to Brooklyn, never to return that day. We went for Juma and that was it, And so we did some very significant and meaningful things. And I just thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that I was able to be a part of it. And I pray that you youngsters realize your value. Don't let anybody tell you that you don't have a value. Don't ever let anybody tell you that you can't do this because you're a woman. If they do, just remind them of our mother Aisha, radiallahu ta'ala anha. Were it not for her, we'd be minus a couple thousand traditions, if it were not for her. So don't let anybody try to come along and devalue you and say you're not this, you're not that. Like I said at the beginning, most of Imam Malik's teachers and students were females. He had the largest female groupings around him out of all of the four imams. And that wasn't by mistake or by chance, And so you have a significant role in what you are doing. I thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that I'm alive to see it happening, because I would have never thought it in my youth. It was something that was like a far-fetched reality. But when this little girl that you're friends here with started her stuff in high school, junior high school, in fact, I said to myself, okay, this is it. This is going to be one of them. I don't know who else is going to follow in the footsteps, but this is one. And it has been a journey that has been a significant one. And if the predecessors of your predecessors of Dar-ul-Islam were alive to see what you all are doing, they'd be honored. Because what you are doing is what we could only dream of. We dreamt about it. And alhamdulillah, you've accomplished it. And that's an accomplishment that's worthy of full recognition. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed you all. And keep doing what you're doing. Don't stop. Remember that little thing, little story you saw about when y'all was kids, the little train that could? Y'all just keep chugging along like that. Don't stop. Keep doing what you're doing, alhamdulillah, because the work is always there. It's got to be done in conjunction with Sister, the other Kameelah is doing with the collection. I have struggled trying to. There was one brother that we knew. He had moved to California, and he had virtually every tape of Imam Yahya's khutbahs.
Wow.
He has passed, and when he passed, we tried to reach out to him. Well, we had reached out. We didn't know that he had passed. When we reached out, we found out that he had passed. And these tapes had fallen into the hands of his son, who was no more part of Dar-ul-Islam other than because of his father, because when he left Brooklyn, you know, he kind of fell out from the movement. And I don't think this young man understood the value of these tapes, but we have not been able to gather them and collect them. There was one other brother who was living here in upstate New York. When he passed, his son too was disaffected by what all was going on. So some of the things that he collaborated on with Khalil, you know, we were never able to retrieve any of that. So what you all are doing is significant. As far as connecting all of the dots and trying to find all of the locations of different Dar Jamaats, that's going to be a task that might be harder than achievable, because we were very, very bad at record keeping at that point. And so when things kind of fell apart and when the movement split up, we lost valuable documentation because those who were with Jelani thought that it was their claim to have, and so we lost a lot of documents and information. And so we were subject to a lot of those things when the assassination took place in 74. We lost a lot of documents because the FBI raided the Masjid and took every piece of paper they could find that wasn't nailed down. So we lost a lot of those documentations, never been able to get it back. And so there was a lot that was lost. So what has been done here, it has been done only by the permission of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the work is invaluable. And just keep it up. Just keep it up. What you young ladies are doing, man, subhanallah. I only wish I could have did it when I was your age.
Well, you were busy doing other things.
Well, I think, and I
Yeah.
think that's the thing. You say you were bad at record keeping. That's not true. And this is something that we all struggle with, right? Like when you're doing the work, you're doing the work, right? Like you don't have the time to think about, okay, how is this going to be remembered? And that's why the oral histories are also so important. When you have this brief moment to pause and reflect on all of the work that you did, that is part of, keeping the records and keeping it.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Well, if that's the case, Kameelah, you got to
Also, it
keep
was-
shaking the cage because there's a lot of cobwebs up here. So just remember that a lot of cobwebs are going on.
I think, what I said is true. I think I just have to start recording, right? Because I'll ask one question. I'll be like, Abu, do you remember the brother in this photo? And then like 3 hours later, I'm like, Abu, I gotta go because I gotta put Izzy to bed. And, they're like, who are you talking to for like 3 hours? But I think there is a way that we're building on a foundation, right? Even of having, Brother Kameelah Abdul-Kareem as the photographer, one of the photographers, that there being a written record through Jihadul Akbar. So I think there was, right? Just, I think, again, well ahead of its time, some attention to, we have to have our own story and narrative out there to the best of our ability. And so, again, I think it's one of the hallmarks of the movement that we actually have not just sort of anecdotes, but we have like visual representation. We have text, right, of people saying, actually, I found the name of a friend of mine who's a filmmaker, Nashin Dadaboy. There's reference to, I think, a great uncle in an obituary section of Jihadul Akbar. And I was like, how did this Pakistani Dadaboy get sort of memorialized in Jihadul Akbar, like a Brooklyn magazine? So I said to her, and she's like, yeah, my I think it was her great uncle or some elder in her family who was a part of sort of disseminating information about Islam. And so the people sort of recognized him, right, as someone who was very supportive of this, American movement. And so I was like, all of these ways that even now, the descendants of the people who started the movement and who were also part of other sort of related movements at the time are also connecting to each other, right? Like that was 2 or 3 generations before me. And now I think Nashin is also gathering the history of her family, right, of the Dada Boys. So I think all of these ways that like there is a time and a season for everything. So I'm hoping that in this season, it inspires more people just to have conversations with their families, right? Asking their parents, like, what brought you to Islam? What kept you in Islam? And for me, it's thinking about my own children and how they know who they are, right? And so my son Bilal, he's in college, and I tell him, remember who you are, right? When you're representing, especially this name, he says they don't know how to pronounce this name in Wilmington, North Carolina, right? He becomes so many different things. But knowing, right, like my name is Bilal is connected to this, right? This history is really significant. So inshallah, I think everyone has a role to play and a contribution to make. That's a family photo, it's an anecdote, it's, there's always an auntie, a mom who has this like box of documents, right? Like name changes to, which is another, I think, kind of contribution of the Dar, people changing their names, dressing a certain way. So all of this, I think, is just history that is just, and treasure that is waiting to be discovered, and everyone has some of it. And so my hope is that through the people's effort, through the Dar-ul-Islam collection, that we just continue to gather, right? And, perhaps our children sort of take on what is sort of the next, iteration of this gathering of history that continues to just, I think, ground us and let us know without a doubt, that there's the legacy, there's an influence, there's an importance here that can't be forgotten, right? We have to go back and get it. So alhamdulillah.
Can I just add something to that?
Yeah.
I think it's just so important thinking about every human being as like a living library, and you started by talking about Brother Mukhtar Curtis, who, it was like a month, not even a month ago that he passed away. And these are the things. It's like, these are the living libraries. And as you know, both of us were in academia, we're constantly reading all of these written histories about Islam in America. And it's like, some of them are wrong. Some of them acted like certain things didn't happen. And the people who lived those, who were in that room, in that mosque, on that corner, whatever, are still here. And it's important. It's so important to preserve that. And I want to uplift, I think Brother Maurice Hines, he made a comment, or I don't see it anymore, but he's a librarian and is doing this amazing work around, even has a book. Actually just looked up right now. The Oral Histories for Muslim Communities, a specific grassroots guide to conducting oral histories on Muslim communities in the US. It's really important to kind of build on this, because if and that, I think for me, and I noticed this with my own work with the Tijani community, it's like there's all of these amazing women and men who everybody in the community knows. But when I try to do archival research on them, their names don't show up anywhere. But we know that their memories and their contributions are so significant. But, in 50 years, you're not going to be able to find a New York Times article on them or anything like that. But they were they were the ones who created the school. They were the ones who did this. So whatever it is, if it's the tape recorder, if it's like doing Zoom interviews and live streaming them on YouTube, that's what we've been doing. Just really big things. Like, later somebody can come around and make it a cool documentary or whatever else. But the first step is just literally offering people a space to speak. And even thinking about the Dar-ul-Islam collection, like part of the reason why we have, from my understanding, the two books from Sheikh Mahmoud and Dr. Kamal is because they wrote those histories out, right? I know there's a sister, El-Amin, who's really encouraging a lot of elders to write their own stories, and it doesn't have to be people who have been lifelong learners. It's just, what do you remember? Even despite the cobwebs, whatever you remember is very significant. So I just want to give a further push to all of the different players, those who lived it, those who have the recorders, to we collectively kind of preserve this history, because you would just what we're doing is so significant that we and the time just flies, and these are living libraries and living histories. So
yes. Alhamdulillah.
So it is now 9:30 on the East Coast.
SubhanAllah.
And
we started at 7, huh?
Yes. So there's so much more to be said. I think conversations really, I'm hoping that it's a catalyst for everyone to sort of see their own family history in an important light. How did we get here? What should I know? Dr. Amna Aldeen, in my interview with her, as a scholar, someone who literally wrote African American Islam, one of the questions that, she started to get me to think about is even just asking people, what do you know that you learned how to do as a member of the Dar, right? And so she said the Dar's thoughts are everywhere, right? She said the way that men and women behave, what are habits that were formed in the Dar. And so for people to, again, be able to connect their what they're doing presently, right? The language that they're using, the way that they're speaking, the thoughts that they have, to an actual movement, right? Where this was taught. So I'm just hoping and praying that, everyone sort of sees themselves as a contributor to this living history. And certainly through the peopleseffort.com, I'm still, interested in interviewing people to share their stories, and for us to begin to sort of gather what are those key takeaways, what should we be proud of, what should we still continue to reflect on, and to know that these, as I started with that painting that was not correct, it is our obligation to do it, and if we don't, then if we don't do this, can we really complain about the way that someone is misrepresenting who we are? I think everybody knows the answer. My answer to that question: no, we can't. We can be mad about it, but you need to do something about it.
Do something about it,
so with that, this is just like maybe a tiny snapshot of the kind of 3-hour conversations that I have with my Abu about, there's so much to explore. And I hope people are able to, find this conversation meaningful and will continue, right? It's beginning, not an end. So Abu, can you close us out with dua, and this recording, inshallah, will be sent and sent to everyone so that they can play it back. And these slides, of course, but also the peopleseffort.com, all of this information is there.
Ameen. Ameen. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. Ameen. And this was something that the Sahaba used to always do when they would close with this surah, because that was their intent, to reach those goals in that dua, and we want to be among those who are steadfast when there's difficulty and moving forward when there's ease. And inshallah, like I said, ladies, keep up the work, keep me on speed dial, catch me anytime, knock the cobwebs loose. I got a lot more to say. I just got to make sure I got it in the right place at the right time. And inshallah, anytime. And like I said, I really enjoy reading this work. And when I tell people about it, they be like, "They doing what?" And I'm like, "Yeah, this is what's going on." And a lot of people don't think, because that was one of the failures of Dar-ul-Islam. And I'll say this, that we were not good stewards of maintaining our history. And part of it was because, like you said, Doctor, you saw that in in Jihadul Akbar, all these articles had no names. That was by design. That was a mistake. That was by design. That was to keep the egos down and a bunch of other things. And though it was well intended, it had its drawbacks, because now you sit down and say, man, how could we reach out and touch the person that wrote this and wrote that? We don't know who wrote it. We don't know who did it, because the main brain behind Jihadul Akbar is deceased as well. So
Well, I'm going to say, I think that you're still being very hard on yourself. I think there's so much that has been given to us. It almost seems like the tragedy is that there isn't more we have done. And so I think it's, again, everyone's responsibility to capture the history. It's not on me or Dr. Samiha or you or one individual, but, as I acknowledged from the beginning, it's building on the personal memoirs, the Dar-ul-Islam collection, right? The scholars who have studied, Islam in Black America, Islam in America in general. Everyone has something to contribute. So I think it's maybe unfair to say, oh, we didn't do this, or we should have. Yeah, retrospectively.
Because I think there's so much more that we should have did that we didn't do. I think that.
But it was also unparalleled what you did do. Like, it's funny because even Dr. Miller, you started with the quote from Robin Kelly about we shouldn't measure the movements by their successes, but also the Dar-ul-Islam was very successful. Like, so let's not forget that. Like, businesses, all of it, SubhanAllah.
Oh yeah. I mean, what we did, by Allah's mercy, will how was that phrase? Often duplicated but never replicated, or something
underappreciated,
but it'll never happen again. What we did was unique for that moment in time in history, and that's something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for allowing me to have spent 12 years inside that movement and given 12 years of devotion of my life to the establishment and advancement of that movement. And if I had the chance to do it again, I'd do it all over again.
Alhamdulillah.
I'd do it all over again. I'd be a little smart about some things, but I'd do it again. Those were the 12 years. I think those are the 12 best years of my life in terms of pushing Islam forward.
Yes.
And
I immediately made the connection to 12 years a slave, right? But 12 years, right, in service of the deen, in service of the community, right? Of this life-giving message. So with that, we will say Salaam alaikum and have a good rest of your evening. This,
Yeah,
of course, this recording, like this conversation becomes a part of the archive, so it will be shared. Thank you to Dr. Samiha and for your work as well, and Abu always for sharing what was and is your life in the Dar.
There's a lot more.
Yes.
Thank you so much. This was amazing, and I benefited so much from both of you. So thank you.
There's a lot more, and anytime you feel like tapping the till, let me know.
Okay.
I'm ready. You know.
All right.
All right.
All right. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.